A new beginning. Emeka had always dreamed of a simple life, peaceful, grounded, and filled with love. A young man from a small Nigerian village, he had recently married Ngozi, a woman with a mysterious aura. Despite her beauty and gentle demeanor, there was something about her that made Emeka uneasy. He couldn't quite place it, but he had a feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. After their wedding, Emeka and Ngozi moved into a modest home at the edge of the village, near the dense, whispering forest that had long been a source of local legends. Emeka was excited to start their new life together, away from the bustling center of the village. The house was small, cozy, with walls that creaked as the wind passed through, but it was theirs, and that was all that mattered to him. However, as they unpacked their belongings, something unexpected caught Emeka's eye. Ngozi opened a large, woven basket and pulled out a large, glistening snake, smooth, dark scales that shimmered in the light. It was beautiful, in a way that only a snake could be, but its size and intensity sent a chill down Emeka's spine. Ngozi held the snake with a tenderness that puzzled him. The snake coiled around her arms, its eyes locking with Emeka's, and for a moment, he felt as though the creature was studying him. "Honey, meet Olu," Ngozi said, her voice calm and soothing as she smiled at him. "She's my pet." Emeka froze. He had never been fond of snakes, and this one was unlike any he had ever seen. His heart raced, and his palms grew sweaty. "A pet?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Ngozi, you can't be serious. This thing, it's huge." Ngozi laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Olu is harmless. She's been with me since I was a child, remember?" She smiled again, almost as though she were reassuring herself. "She's a gift from my ancestors. They trust her, and so should you." Emeka's eyes darted nervously to the snake, whose tongue flicked out, tasting the air. It seemed to be watching him closely, its gaze sharp, intelligent, almost predatory. "But it's a snake, Ngozi. I've heard stories about how snakes can bring bad luck or other things. Shouldn't it be kept in a zoo or somewhere far away from the house?" Ngozi shook her head, her expression soft but firm. "Olu is different. She's not like the snakes you hear about in stories. She's my protector. My companion. She'll never hurt us." Despite her calming words, a sense of unease lingered in Emeka's chest. He had never been superstitious, but the strange connection between his wife and the snake unsettled him. How could she have had such a deep bond with it? He tried to ignore the feeling and focus on the excitement of their new life together. Maybe he was just overthinking things. After all, Ngozi had always been a woman with a mysterious side, and it was part of what had drawn him to her in the first place. But as the days passed, Emeka's unease only grew. The snake, Olu, was always present, either coiled in the corner of the room or gliding silently through the house. Emeka couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, waiting for something. At night, when Emeka would lie awake, he could hear the soft sound of the snake's movements as it slithered through the house. It was as though it was making sure everything was in place, ensuring that no harm would come to its mistress. But Emeka wasn't so sure. There was something unnatural about the way Olu moved, how it seemed to glide effortlessly across the floor without making a sound. "Emeka, are you still worried about Olu?" Ngozi's voice broke through his thoughts one evening as they sat together in the living room. She had noticed the tension in his posture, the way he avoided looking at the snake. "I'm not worried," Emeka replied quickly, though his voice was shaky. I don't know, Ngozi. I've never been around something like this before. It's just so different." Ngozi leaned forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Her smile was warm, but there was a depth to her eyes that he couldn't quite understand. "I promise you, Olu won't harm you. She's been a part of my life for so long. She's more than just a pet. She's a part of who I am. Emeka looked at the snake, which was now coiled at Ngozi's feet, its eyes gleaming in the low light of the room. He couldn't deny that there was something enchanting about it. But it also felt like something he couldn't quite grasp. Something ancient, untouchable, and perhaps even dangerous. As he settled into bed that night, the uneasy feeling lingered in the back of his mind. He told himself that he was overthinking it, that it was just a snake, and Ngozi had assured him that everything was fine. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Olu than met the eye. Something deeper. Something he wasn't ready to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, all Emeka could do was try to fall asleep, knowing that the mysterious bond between his wife and her snake was just the beginning of a story he never could have predicted, the whisper of legends. As the days passed in their new home, Emeka couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The village, which he had once considered quiet and peaceful, now seemed filled with whispers, hidden stories, rumors, and ancient warnings that floated in the air like a fog. One evening, after returning from a long day of work, Emeka decided to visit the village elders. He had been hearing strange things about Olu, the snake, and he needed answers. His unease had grown too large to ignore. It was not just the snake's presence in his home, but the strange sense of foreboding that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The elders were seated around the fire, their faces lit by the dancing flames. They spoke in low, harsh tones, their words laced with the wisdom of ages. When Emeka approached, they welcomed him with respectful nods, but there was something in their eyes that seemed to hint at a deeper knowledge, one they weren't eager to share. "Emeka," said one of the elders, a man named Okoro, his voice gravelly with age. "You've been married to Ngozi for some time now. How does the house feel?" Emeka hesitated. "It feels fine, but there's something unsettling about the snake. I'm not sure I trust it. And I've been hearing rumors, stories, about Olu." Okoro's eyes narrowed, and the other elders grew quiet, their faces shifting to solemn expressions. It was clear that Emeka had touched on something they were reluctant to speak of. "You have heard correctly, young man," Okoro said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are stories, old ones. Stories of Olu, the snake that guards the secrets of our people. But these are not stories for the faint of heart." Emeka leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What secrets? What is Olu?" Okoro exchanged a glance with the other elders before continuing. "Long ago, before the land was settled and before the village as you know it was built, there was a great war. A war between our ancestors and a powerful force from beyond this world. To protect this village, the elders of that time called upon the spirit of a guardian, a serpent from the deep forest. This serpent, Olu, became the protector of the village, a guardian of both life and death. It was said that Olu could see into the hearts of men and sense danger before it arrived. But Olu also carried a curse, one that was bound to the bloodline of the protector. Your wife, Ngozi, carries that bloodline. She is the descendant of the first keeper of the serpent." Emeka's mind raced as he absorbed Okoro's words. He had always known that there was something unique about Ngozi, but he had never imagined anything so otherworldly. A serpent that guarded the village's secrets. A guardian tied to his wife's bloodline. Is it true that the snake has been here for centuries? Emeka asked, trying to digest everything he was hearing. Yes, Okoro replied. Olu has lived longer than any of us. It has watched over this land for generations. But its presence is both a blessing and a curse. For while it protects us from dangers we cannot see, it also binds those who are connected to it. The curse, it lingers, Emeka. And it can turn deadly if disturbed. Emeka felt a chill crawl down his spine. What do you mean by disturbed? The curse, Okoro continued, his voice heavy with caution. If the balance is disrupted, if the protector is not respected, or if the serpent feels threatened, it will lash out. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. The serpent will protect its own, and it will do whatever it takes to ensure its survival. It has the power to move beyond the physical realm and affect the very spirit of the one who threatens it. Emeka's heart began to race as he thought of his growing fear of Olu. The strange occurrences in the house. The unsettling feeling whenever the snake was near him. It was all starting to make sense now, but that only made it more terrifying. What should I do? Emeka asked, his voice trembling. How can I live with something like this in my house? Okoro's gaze softened. Respect it, Emeka. Acknowledge its role. It is not just a pet, as your wife has told you. Olu is a keeper of the old ways. As long as you treat it with respect and do not disturb the harmony between it and Ngozi, you will be safe. But be careful. For if that harmony is broken, the consequences can be dire. Emeka nodded slowly, though his mind was filled with more questions than answers. He stood up to leave, but before he could step away, Okoro called out to him. One more thing, Emeka. Beware the eyes of the serpent. They see more than you think. It is said that Olu can read the soul, and sometimes, when you look into its eyes, it can show you things you might not be ready to see. Emeka didn't fully understand what Okoro meant, but something about the way the elder said it made his skin prickle. He thanked the elders and walked back home, his thoughts clouded by the weight of the story he had just heard. That night, as he sat in his living room, Emeka couldn't help but glance toward the corner where Olu usually rested. The snake was curled up, but its eyes, those piercing eyes, seemed to be watching him. He felt an uncomfortable shiver run down his spine. He had been trying to push his fear aside, but now, with the elder's words in his mind, he couldn't escape the growing sense of dread. Whenever he looked at Olu, it felt as though the serpent was reading him, probing him, as though it knew something he didn't. Emeka couldn't shake the feeling that the snake was not just a passive observer, but an active participant in his life, perhaps even a silent judge of his every thought and action. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. Emeka realized that he had not just married Ngozi, he had also married the serpent. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences of that union, the disappearance. The peaceful routine of village life shattered one crisp morning when Emeka heard the news. A child from the neighboring house had gone missing. Little Shinonso, the younger son of the family that lived 2 houses down, had disappeared overnight. His parents, frantic with worry, had already begun searching the entire village and the surrounding woods. By mid-morning, the whole village was gripped by fear and anxiety, the air heavy with unanswered questions. Emeka stood outside his home, his heart pounding in his chest as the villagers gathered in small, concerned groups. Everyone was speaking in hushed tones, casting nervous glances at one another. Some whispered about strange happenings in the village, things that had been ignored, dismissed as coincidences until now. The elders exchanged knowing looks, but no one seemed willing to openly speak of what they feared. Emeka. Ngozi's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. She had come outside, her face pale and tense. Have you heard about Shinonso? He nodded, his thoughts racing. Yes, everyone's saying he's missing. But what could have happened? It doesn't make sense. He was here one moment and gone the next. Ngozi shook her head, her eyes clouded with concern. It's strange, but it's not the first time something like this has happened. You remember when the other children, those from the neighboring village, vanished, don't you? Emeka's breath hitched at the mention of the past. He did remember, faint memories from his childhood, stories whispered by elders about children who had mysteriously disappeared in the night, never to be found. The connection between those disappearances and the serpent had never been discussed openly. But now, standing in the midst of the village's fear and confusion, Emeka couldn't shake the thought that Olu might somehow be involved. He couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that had been growing in his mind for days. Could Olu be linked to Chinonso's disappearance? He remembered the strange way the snake had watched him. The way it seemed to know more than it should. His thoughts spiraled, and he found himself torn between the growing dread in his heart and the love he had for his wife, Ngozi. "I don't know, Ngozi," Emeka said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I keep thinking. What if it's Olu? What if the snake has something to do with it? I've heard stories, rumors. You can't ignore what's happening around us." Ngozi's eyes flickered with discomfort at his words, but she quickly recovered, her tone soft but firm. "No, Emeka. Olu would never harm anyone. She's not like that. She only protects. You have to believe me." Her voice trembled slightly, as if she were trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince him. But Emeka could see the uncertainty behind her words. There was a momentary hesitation in her gaze, a fleeting glance that seemed to say more than she was willing to admit. Emeka felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Something wasn't right, and for the first time, he wondered if his wife was hiding something from him. Was she keeping secrets about Olu that she didn't want him to know? His mind spun, and in a desperate bid for clarity, he decided to speak with one of the elders. He needed answers, something, anything, to make sense of the growing darkness surrounding them. He sought out Okoro, the elder who had spoken to him before. Okoro was sitting under the shade of an old tree, his weathered face unreadable. He beckoned Emeka to sit beside him. "Okoro," Emeka began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to know the truth. There's something off about all of this. I don't believe Chinonso's disappearance is just a coincidence. Do you think Olu has anything to do with it?" Okoro's expression hardened as he listened to Emeka's words. He did not speak immediately, but when he finally did, his voice was low and measured. "Olu is not a simple creature, Emeka. It is bound to forces much older than any of us. It was called upon long ago, not just to protect, but to punish those who threaten the balance of the village. Those who disrupt the peace, those who go against the ways of our ancestors." Emeka's heart pounded as he absorbed Okoro's words. "Are you saying that Olu, that the snake is behind the disappearances? That it is some kind of punishment?" Okoro nodded gravely. "Yes. It is said that Olu guards the balance between the living and the spirits. When the harmony of this village is disturbed, when the line between the physical and spiritual world is blurred, Olu acts. It does not kill, but it takes what belongs to the spirits, those who are lost or whose souls are unworthy." Emeka's blood ran cold. The weight of Okoro's words settled heavily on him. Was it possible that Olu had taken Chinonso to restore some ancient balance? The idea of a snake being capable of such an act was almost too much to bear. "What do I do now?" Emeka asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Okoro gazed at him with somber eyes. "You must be cautious, Emeka. Olu is a force that cannot be controlled. It will do what it must, and it is bound by the ancient curse. Your wife, Ngozi, she is connected to this force. She is the keeper, the last in the line of those who have served the serpent." Emeka's mind raced. His suspicions had been right. Olu was more than just a pet. It was a powerful, ancient being, connected to his wife in ways he could not fully understand. And now, the village was at risk because of it. But was Ngozi aware of the full extent of her connection to the serpent? And was she keeping something from him? Returning home that evening, Emeka felt the weight of the mystery growing heavier. He watched Ngozi as she moved about their house, her every motion graceful, but he could not escape the nagging suspicion in his chest. Did she know more than she had let on? Was Olu somehow tied to the curse that had taken Chinonso? That night, as Emeka lay awake, the house eerily quiet, he could not shake the feeling that Olu was watching him. He could hear the faint sound of its movements, the hiss of its tongue as it slithered across the floor. And in the darkness, he swore he saw its eyes, shining with an ancient, knowing gaze, staring directly at him, as though it had seen into his very soul. His fear grew, and with it, the realization that the snake was not just a creature of the past. It was part of the future, part of the fate that was now entwined with his own. He was trapped in a web of secrets, and he had no idea how to escape. A growing distance. As the days turned into weeks, Emeka found himself slowly consumed by the mystery of Olu. The weight of the village's whispers and the unsettling tales of the snake's ancient power hung heavy on his mind, suffocating him with doubt. His marriage, once filled with warmth and laughter, began to feel cold, distant, just like the house they lived in. The quiet tension that had settled between him and Ngozi was palpable, like a thick fog that neither of them could see through. Ngozi, who had once been so open and affectionate, now seemed to retreat into herself. She spent more and more time with Olu, and Emeka couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in her behavior. There was an eerie calm about her, an almost otherworldly composure, as if she were becoming more attuned to the serpent's presence than to him. It was as though a bond had been forged between them, one that Emeka could neither see nor understand. Every time Emeka would try to engage with her, to speak with her about his fears, she would brush him off, her responses growing colder, more distant. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, now seemed vacant, as if something was slipping away from her with each passing day. One evening, after a long day of work, Emeka came home to find Ngozi sitting on the floor, speaking softly to Olu. The snake, coiled lazily around her, seemed almost to be listening, its golden eyes fixed on her as she whispered words Emeka could not hear. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he stepped back into the shadows, watching from the doorway. "What are you doing?" he finally called out, unable to hold back his concern. Ngozi looked up, startled, but her expression softened as if she hadn't been fully aware of her own actions. "I'm just talking to Olu, Emeka. She's my companion, you know that." But something in her tone made Emeka's stomach tighten. She had never spoken about the snake this way before, like it was a confidant, a friend, a guide. The way she said it made the snake sound almost human, as if Olu were an equal. Emeka couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the most important person in his wife's life. "I'm not sure about this, Ngozi," Emeka said, his voice shaking with frustration. "There's something off about it. You've been spending all your time with Olu. What about me? What about us?" She stood up slowly, her movements graceful but detached. "Emeka, I've told you, Olu is not a threat. She's here to protect us. You don't need to be afraid. You just have to trust me." But trust was becoming harder to give. Every time Emeka looked at her, he saw the growing distance between them, like an invisible wall that had risen between him and the woman he had married. The bond she shared with the snake was becoming stronger than the one they had once had. Emeka's mind raced. Could it be that Olu was somehow controlling her, manipulating her, guiding her actions? His suspicions only deepened when, late one night, he woke to an eerie silence. The house was still, too still, as though something was watching him. He sat up, feeling an unsettling pull, a sense of foreboding that gripped him in the darkness. Then, he heard it, the soft, rhythmic hissing, the unmistakable sound of a serpent moving through the house. At first, Emeka told himself it was nothing, just his imagination running wild, the product of too many days spent worrying about things beyond his understanding. But then, the hissing grew louder, closer. His heart began to race, and he swung his legs off the bed, feet meeting the cool floor with a soft thud. He stood in the doorway of their room, his breath shallow, his senses heightened. Olu was not in her usual corner of the living room. The house was completely silent now, but he could feel the presence of the snake, watching, waiting. It was as if it had been waiting for him to wake, waiting for him to notice. Suddenly, a chill swept through the room. Emeka turned toward the source of the cold air and saw the snake. Olu was no longer coiled up in the corner, but was instead moving slowly toward him, its body gliding silently across the floor. Its eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Emeka felt a sharp, inexplicable fear grip him. It was as if the snake could see inside him, through the layers of his thoughts and fears, to the very core of his soul. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ngozi," he called out, his voice a mixture of fear and desperation. "Where are you? What's happening?" But no answer came. The silence that followed only deepened the dread that had begun to grow in Emeka's chest. He watched as the snake slowly advanced toward him, its body undulating with a hypnotic grace. It was Olu, but something was different now. The snake wasn't just an animal, it felt like a presence, something ancient, something beyond Emeka's understanding. The golden eyes of the snake seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and for a moment, Emeka could have sworn they were glowing with a strange, ethereal power. He reached out instinctively, his body trembling as he tried to force his fear into control. Then, in a soft, almost imperceptible hiss, he heard it. It wasn't a sound that came from the snake, but something that echoed deep within his mind. "I am here, Emeka. I have been waiting for you to understand." The words were not spoken aloud, but somehow Emeka heard them, felt them deep within him, as if they had been planted there, drawn from his own subconscious. He took a step back, his hands shaking as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Had the snake just communicated with him? Before he could react further, a soft voice broke through the tension. "Emeka, please. Don't be afraid." It was Ngozi, standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with a strange mix of concern and something darker, something he couldn't name. "Olu is not our enemy," she said softly, stepping toward him. "It's here to help us, to protect us. But you don't understand, do you?" Emeka looked at her, his heart racing, his mind spinning with the weight of the moment. He wanted to reach out to her, to pull her away from the snake, but there was something about her now, a coldness, a distance, that stopped him. As Olu slid back into the shadows, Emeka could feel the growing divide between them, a chasm that seemed to widen with every passing moment. He realized then that Ngozi was no longer the woman he had married. Something was different. The snake had changed her. And he was losing her, just as he was losing himself in the mystery that surrounded them both. In that moment, Emeka knew that his obsession with the snake had only deepened the divide between him and his wife. But it was too late to turn back now. The serpent had marked their fate, and there was no escaping the growing darkness that loomed over their future, uncovering the truth. The weight of uncertainty and fear had grown unbearable. Each day, Emeka became more and more consumed by the mystery surrounding Olu and his wife, Ngozi. The stories he had heard from the village elders had planted a seed of doubt that now sprouted into a full-fledged obsession. He could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that there was something far more significant, and far more dangerous, at play. Emeka had to know the truth. He had to understand what Olu was, what its true role in their lives was, and, most importantly, what part Ngozi played in all of this. The cold distance between them had grown too wide to ignore, and every time he looked at her, he saw a woman he no longer recognized. Olu had changed her, and Emeka feared that his obsession with the serpent was no longer the only threat to their marriage, it was their very existence. One evening, after hours of restless contemplation, Emeka decided to seek the answers he desperately needed. He remembered the old shrine deep in the forest, the one the elders had mentioned during their stories, the one where the ancestors had once communicated with the spirits. There, perhaps, he would find the truth he was searching for. The sun had set by the time Emeka left the village, walking cautiously toward the edge of the forest. The trees stood tall and dark, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, as if trying to keep him from venturing further. The air felt thick with an ancient energy, heavy with the weight of forgotten secrets. But Emeka pressed on, determined to uncover the mysteries that had haunted him for so long. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the sounds of the village faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the woods. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of night creatures. His steps grew slower as he neared the shrine, the energy around him growing more intense, more oppressive. It felt as though the very land itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to discover what had been hidden for centuries. At last, Emeka reached the shrine. It was an ancient structure, overgrown with vines and moss, its stones weathered by time and neglect. Yet, despite the years of abandonment, there was an undeniable aura of power around it. The air seemed to vibrate with energy as Emeka stepped closer, his heart racing. Inside the shrine, on an altar made of stone, lay a series of carvings, intricate symbols and figures that Emeka could barely understand. But one symbol stood out to him, the image of a large serpent, coiled around a human figure, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Emeka's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the serpent depicted in the carvings was unmistakably Olu. He carefully examined the walls, trying to make sense of the ancient text, when a soft voice echoed in the shadows. It wasn't the voice from the shrine itself, but something deeper, older, as though it had been imprinted into the stones. The serpent is the keeper of balance. It binds the spirit of the village to the forces of life and death. The serpent guards the gateway to the past, to the secrets that must never be unearthed. The words were like a thunderclap in Emeka's mind. His hands trembled as he reached for the stone wall, touching the cool surface where the words had been etched. He had stumbled upon something far more powerful than he had anticipated, a dark revelation that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. The serpent's bond with the protector is eternal. It is not a pet, but a spirit guardian. And the protector is chosen from a lineage, a bloodline that has existed since the dawn of the village's founding. Emeka's heart skipped a beat. The words were clear now. Olu was no mere pet, but a guardian, a spirit tasked with watching over the village, ensuring that its darkest secrets were kept hidden. And the protector of the serpents was not chosen randomly, it was a position that had been passed down through generations. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Ngozi wasn't just his wife. She was the last descendant of the ancient lineage, the one destined to serve as the protector of Olu, the one chosen to guard the village's most dangerous secrets. The realization hit him like a wave. The bond between Ngozi and Olu went deeper than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a relationship of affection or companionship, it was a spiritual connection, forged by ancient forces, stretching back centuries. Olu was not merely a guardian of the village, but of the powerful, hidden forces that had shaped its history. And Ngozi, as its last descendant, was bound to this destiny, to this responsibility, in a way Emeka could never fully understand. Emeka stumbled back from the altar, his mind reeling. He had never thought of Ngozi in this light. He had married her out of love, not knowing the depth of the ancient powers that flowed through her blood. Now, he realized that their union was not just a marriage, it was a binding of forces older than time itself. But what did it mean for him? Was he simply a bystander, caught in the wake of a destiny that was not his own? Or was he, too, bound to the serpent in ways he could not yet comprehend? In the distance, Emeka could hear the soft rustling of leaves, as if something, or someone, was approaching. He felt a chill run down his spine, his thoughts racing. Had Olu followed him here? Had the serpent sensed that he was getting too close to the truth? The air around him grew thick with an unsettling energy. With one final glance at the shrine, Emeka turned and ran, the weight of his discovery pressing heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: the truth had changed everything. The bond between Ngozi and Olu was no accident, it was fate. And now, Emeka had to decide whether he would accept the truth or whether he would try to break free from the web of destiny that had entangled him. As he raced back to the village, the echoes of the ancient voice reverberated in his mind. The serpent will protect, but it will also destroy. Those who seek to break the bond will face the wrath of the guardian. The final choice. Emeka had barely slept the night after his discovery at the shrine. The weight of the ancient truth he had uncovered about Olu, about Ngozi's lineage, and about the forces that bound them together sat heavy on his chest. His mind raced, unable to settle. He could no longer deny the reality of the situation. His life, his marriage, had become entangled in something far greater than himself. And now, he stood at a crossroads, facing a decision that would not only alter the course of his life but determine the fate of the entire village. He had learned that Olu was not just a snake, not just a creature to be feared, but a guardian, a spiritual force that had protected the village for centuries. And Ngozi, his wife, was the last in a line of protectors, the one chosen to maintain the delicate balance between the physical world and the spiritual realm. The knowledge of this connection both frightened him and filled him with awe. But there was also something else, something that lingered in his heart. Despite all the fear and confusion, Emeka had to ask himself, could he accept this strange, supernatural bond between his wife and the serpent? Or would he try to break free, to escape the suffocating grip of destiny that had ensnared him? The choice before him was not one to be made lightly. His heart ached at the thought of losing Ngozi, of losing the woman he had loved, but the reality of their bond, the knowledge of the ancient forces that connected them, was more than he had ever imagined. Could he live with the truth? Could he share his life with the serpent, with the weight of the curse and the responsibility that came with it? That evening, he found himself alone with Ngozi in their home. The house was quiet, the soft rustle of the leaves outside the only sound that broke the stillness. Emeka stood at the doorway, watching her, as she sat with Olu coiled comfortably beside her. The snake seemed to be waiting, as though it, too, knew that the time had come for a final confrontation. Ngozi, Emeka began, his voice low and steady. I've learned the truth. About you. About Olu. About the bloodline you come from. I know what I'm dealing with now. Ngozi's gaze flickered to him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unsaid words and unspoken fears. Finally, Ngozi stood, slowly and deliberately, her eyes meeting his. I knew you would find out eventually, she said softly. But I didn't want you to see it like this. I didn't want you to be afraid. I'm not afraid of you, Ngozi, Emeka said, his voice rising with a quiet intensity. I'm afraid of what this means. I'm afraid of the bond between you and Olu, the power that controls us both. I don't know how to live in this world anymore. It's too much. Too dangerous. Ngozi took a step forward, her eyes pleading with him. You don't understand, Emeka. Olu has never been a threat to us. It's been protecting us. It's kept us safe from something far worse than what you fear. Emeka felt a knot tighten in his chest. Protecting us from what? From who? There was a long pause before Ngozi spoke again, her voice trembling. There is a darkness in this world, Emeka. A force, an ancient evil that has been watching us, waiting for the moment when the guardian would falter. Olu has kept it at bay, hidden from the village for centuries. The serpent has kept us all safe, but its power is not infinite. It is tied to my bloodline, and that is why I have been chosen. Olu is not just my companion, it's our protector. And if I let go of it, if I try to break free, that darkness will return. It will destroy everything. Emeka's heart pounded in his chest as he absorbed her words. The weight of her confession hung in the air like a dark cloud. The serpent, the creature he had feared, had been protecting them all along. It was not a curse, it was a blessing, a guardian against an unimaginable evil. But the way it watches us, Emeka said, his voice shaking. The way it makes me feel, it's like it's controlling us, like it's always there, always lacking. Ngozi stepped closer to him, her hands gently resting on his. It's not controlling us, Emeka. It's watching over us. Olu sees things we cannot. It feels the dangers we don't know are coming. It has been keeping us safe. And it has kept you safe, too. Emeka felt a surge of realization flood through him. The uneasy feelings, the cold shivers when Olu was near, those were signs, not of danger, but of protection. The snake had been guarding him, watching over him, ensuring that he remained safe from harm. His fear had blinded him to the truth. I've been afraid all along, Emeka whispered. Afraid of what I didn't understand. Ngozi's eyes softened, her expression full of sorrow. I know. And I never wanted to push you away, but I couldn't tell you everything. I couldn't let you see the truth too soon, not before you were ready. But now, the time has come, Emeka. You have to choose. The weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. The choice was his. He could choose to accept the bond between his wife and the serpent, to embrace the protection that Olu offered, or he could try to break free, to walk away from everything he had come to know. But if he chose the latter, he knew the consequences would be dire. The darkness, the evil that had been kept at bay for so long, would return, and this time, it would destroy everything in its path. Emeka took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked at Ngozi, her face a mixture of hope and fear, and then down at Olu, who watched him with those golden, ancient eyes. In that moment, Emeka realized that his fear had been misplaced. Olu was not his enemy, it was his ally. It had been his protector all along, guiding him through the shadows, watching over him. The bond between Ngozi and the snake was not a curse, it was a blessing, a gift passed down through generations to guard the village from an evil that had never truly gone away. With a heart full of resolve, Emeka made his decision. He reached out to Ngozi, pulling her into an embrace. I'll stand by you, Ngozi. And I'll stand by Olu, he said, his voice firm. Together, we will protect this village. Together, we will face whatever comes. Ngozi's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, her face lighting up with relief. Thank you, Emeka. I knew you would understand. We are bound by this, by fate, by the serpent's protection. And we will never be alone. As the two of them stood there, with Olu coiled peacefully at their feet, Emeka knew that their bond, between him, Ngozi, and the serpent, was stronger than any fear, stronger than any darkness that threatened their world. The future was uncertain, but together, they would face whatever came, knowing that they were protected by the ancient power that had always been there, watching over them. The village would be safe. And so would they.